In this video, I'm going to be covering topics like what pigmentation is, the two types of pigmentation, why it occurs on face, and does it actually affect everyone equally. And towards the end of the video, I'm going to devote a whole section on the skincare ingredients that you need to use to prevent and to tackle pigmentation. I'm going to keep this video as engaging as I can. Please stick to the end of the video. I promise you, by the end of the video, you will be equipped with all the knowledge that you need to prevent and to tackle pigmentation on face. Now let's get started. When a section of the face is dark or lighter than the rest of the face, it's called pigmentation. Now this section of the face can either be a patch or it can be a little tiny spot. Pigment means color. Now because this section of the face is different to the rest because of its color, it's called pigmentation. Hyperpigmentation is where this section of the skin is darker than the surrounding skin. Hypopigmentation is where this section of the skin is paler than the surrounding skin. But biologically, what exactly is pigmentation? Melanin is a molecule found in the skin which gives the skin its color. Darker skin tone people have more melanin than the lighter skin tone people. Now within a person, a section of their skin can sometimes end up with more melanin than the rest of the skin. And when that happens, that's what's called hyperpigmentation. And similarly, within a person, a section of their skin can end up with less melanin or zero melanin. And when that happens, that's what's called hypopigmentation. Before I get into the causes for the hyperpigmentation and the hypopigmentation, it's important to understand how exactly this melanin is produced, and I'm going to very briefly touch on that now. Melanin has two important functions. Number one, it protects our skin from irritants, environmental irritants like sun's UV rays, and the number two function is it gives the skin its color. Now skin has two main layers. The first layer, the top layer, is called the epidermis, and the bottom layer is called the dermis. Now epidermis, the top layer, is predominantly made of cells called keratinocytes. Now in between these two layers, that's the epidermis and the dermis, there are a few cells scattered around, and these cells are called melanocytes. Now melanin, the pigment, the molecule, is made inside these melanocyte cells. Now melanin gets produced inside these melanocyte cells, and then it gets transferred into small packages called melanosomes. So melanin gets inside melanosomes, and once it's packaged inside melanosomes, these melanosomes get transferred from these melanocyte cells into keratinocyte cells. Why do they get transferred? Because keratinocyte cells are the predominantly most abundant type of cells in the top layer of skin. Now melanin has to protect the skin, and melanin has to give skin its color. Color is what we see on the visible layer, that's the top layer of skin. To do its protective function and to give the skin its color, this melanin has to exist in the keratinocyte cells, and that's why they get transferred. The melanin gets transferred from melanocytes to keratinocytes. They're packaged inside melanosomes and get transferred to keratinocytes. I know it sounds all geeky, but trust me when I say you really need to understand these steps to be able to tackle the pigmentation with the right skincare ingredients, and I'm going to be touching on that further down the video. There are 5 causes for pigmentation. Number 1 is the sun's UV rays. Number 2 is inflammation from minor trauma. Now this could be because of breakouts, allergens, or it could be because of acne, minor cuts, or minor burns. Number 3 is because of hereditary conditions. Number 4, hormonal imbalance. And number 5, it's because of some medication that you're taking that can cause pigmentation. In this video, I'm going to be talking only about the first 2 causes. That's the sun's UV rays, and the number 2 is pigmentation from inflammation. Though it might sound like only 2 reasons, most of the pigmentation that we have on our face is because of these 2 reasons. Now I'm going to be talking about only these 2 reasons because these are the only 2 reasons that can be tackled with off-the-shelf skincare products that you can actually use without going to a dermatologist and getting a prescription. Does pigmentation affect everyone equally? No. Genetics plays an important role in how much pigmentation a person can get. You see, melanin cells, the cells that produce melanin, is the same. The number of melanocyte cells is the same for everyone. But the amount of melanin that these melanocyte cells can produce differs from person to person. It depends mainly on their genetics. The darker skin tone people, the melanocyte cells in them can produce more melanin than the lighter skin tone people. The lighter skin tone people, the melanocyte cells in them produce much less melanin. Now let me explain this a bit more in detail. Let's take sun's UV rays. Sun's UV rays is one of the main causes for pigmentation on our face. When our skin is exposed to sun's UV rays without any sunscreen, two things happens. One is it burns and the second thing is it tans. It can either burn or it can tan, or sometimes both can happen. How the skin responds to sun's UV rays is called skin phototyping. Now Fitzpatrick method is an accepted method, a widely accepted method to understand the skin phototyping, how the skin responds to sun's UV rays. According to Fitzpatrick method, we've divided skin into 6 categories. The first category is the very fair, and then slowly we get to the 6th category, which is the very dark brown. You see, what happens is, as soon as sun's UV rays touches our skin starts producing more melanin, because one of the main functions of melanin is to protect our skin from sun's UV rays. So when that touches our skin, the melanocyte cells in the skin start going into an overdrive and start producing more melanin. But some skin tone people, the very fair skin tone people, cannot produce a lot of melanin. In fact, they have very less melanin. So when you don't have enough melanin, there's not enough protection, and that's why phototype 1 always burns and never tans. Tanning is when your skin produces an excess amount of melanin. Now the phototype 6, which is the very dark skin tone people, they have an excess amount of melanin, so they have a lot of protection from melanin, so their skin never burns, but it actually tans. So for the in-between phototypes, that is the 2, 3, 4 and 5, you will see a gradual reduction in burning and an increase in tanning, because as the skin gets darker, more melanin gets produced, more protection for the skin. That means more tanning and less burning. A word of caution, melanin can never give complete protection for our skin, and that's why sunscreen comes. So what protection we are talking about here is the minimum protection that skin can offer. So more protection here and less protection here. There are 4 important observations now I would like to make from the Fitzpatrick scale. Now the number 1 observation is phototype 3, 4, 5 and 6. Now what happens there? They've got more melanin, so they have more tanning, less burning, and they tend to hyperpigment a lot because they've got an excess amount of melanin. That's my first observation. The second observation is the phototype 1 and 2, they've got less melanin. That means they've got less protection. When they've got less protection, sun's UV rays can penetrate the skin and damage that melanin producing melanocyte cells in a section of the skin. And when they damage those cells, melanin is lost. When melanin is lost completely or reduces drastically, that section of the skin becomes paler than the rest of the skin, because melanin is what gives the skin its color. And when it becomes paler, that section of the skin is called hypopigment. So phototype 1 and 2 can hypopigment more. Phototype 3, 4, 5 and 6 can hyperpigment more. The third important fact to remember is phototype 3, 4, 5 and 6 can also hypopigment. Sun's UV rays can penetrate and damage those melanocyte cells in spite of them having more melanin. And when that happens, the melanin that's there in that section of the skin reduces drastically, or it can even become 0. And when that happens, that section becomes paler than the rest because it's got no color. So 3, 4, 5 and 6 can also hypopigment. Now the fourth important fact to remember is when the phototypes 3, 4 and 5 and 6 hypopigment, that hypopigmentation is much more visible in them than when phototypes 1 and 2 hypopigment. Now that's because they've got a darker skin tone and suddenly a much paler section of the skin pops up, a huge contrast in color. So hypopigmentation is going to be much more visible in 3, 4, 5 and 6. So those are the 4 important facts to remember. Now I'm going to talk about the post-inflammatory pigmentation. Now this is because of some minor trauma. Maybe it could be because of acne, it could be because of other breakouts on the skin like pimples, it could be because of some threading that you've done the previous day, or the waxing or exfoliation, a minor cut or a minor burn, anything that's minor, a minor irritation to the skin, nothing major. Because if it's major, then you would have to visit the doctor. So these kind of minor, though it's minor, it actually causes a lot of pigmentation on the face. Now what happens is, whenever there's any kind of inflammation on the skin because of these reasons that I just mentioned, inflammation is irritation, redness on the skin. Whenever there's any inflammation on the skin, the melanocyte cells, they spring into action because they produce melanin, and melanin is skin's first layer of defense. So they spring into action and they start producing melanin. These melanocyte cells will continue producing melanin as long as there is inflammation on the skin. Now this is where the problem occurs. Melanin can only offer a certain level of protection. Once that level of protection has been reached, even though more melanin gets produced, it cannot offer any additional protection. But melanocyte cells don't know this. They will continue producing melanin as long as there is inflammation on the skin. Now, darker skin tone people, the melanocyte cells in them can produce, they have the ability to produce more melanin, and so they will produce more melanin. And some of this melanin just becomes excess, because just because it's there doesn't mean it can offer any protection, doesn't mean it can do anything. So it just becomes a waste. Now, the lighter skin tone people, their melanocyte cells can't produce that much melanin. So the chances of having excess melanin in lighter skin tone people is very, very low. Now this excess melanin, all the melanin that's produced by melanocyte cells gets transferred to the keratinocyte cells, including this excess melanin. Now this excess melanin, they just sits there. They just sit in this keratinocyte cells as lumps, and that's what results in hyperpigmentation. And another thing that happens is, when this melanin gets transferred from melanocyte cells to keratinocyte cells, in that hurry, because it's an emergency situation, because there's inflammation on the skin, in that hurry, some of this melanin gets dropped off into the deeper layers of skin, into the dermal layers of skin. In the dermal layers, it's got no role to play. It's not going to give you any color. It's not going to give you any protection. So this lumps of melanin just drops off into the deeper layers, and that's called the dermal pigmentation. And dermal pigmentation is much harder to fix than the surface level pigmentation, which is on the keratinocyte cells. So a couple of important points to remember. As long as there is inflammation on the skin, this melanin will get produced. The important thing that you need to do is to reduce that inflammation. The faster you heal the skin, the sooner you heal the skin, the lesser the chances of pigmentation. All that we've been talking about so far is because of additional melanin, that's more melanin. So this is why it's called post-inflammatory hyperpigmentation. Hyper means more. So post-inflammatory hyperpigmentation. Sometimes this inflammation can also damage the melanocyte cells, and when that happens, the amount of melanin reduces drastically, or sometimes in worst cases there will be no melanin. Then the skin becomes paler, that section becomes paler, and that's called post-inflammatory hypopigmentation, because that section is paler. So the main thing that we need to do is, as soon as there's some inflammation, we need to spring into action and heal the skin, reduce that inflammation, because the inflammation goes down, then this whole problem of pigmentation goes away. So that's our job, to bring that inflammation down. Now the way to reduce pigmentation, if you think about it, based on what we just spoke about in the previous few minutes, There are two pathways. The first one is the anti-pigmentation pathway and the second one is the anti-inflammation pathway. So what I mean by the anti-pigmentation pathway is we're never going to reduce melanin to the levels that it becomes dangerous to our skin. What if we could actually reduce the overproduction of melanin? The anti-pigment pathway is again made up of two different things. First one is if we could actually reduce the overproduction of melanin. The second pathway is if we could actually reduce the transfer of this excess melanin from melanocyte cells into the keratinocyte cells. Now the first one, where we reduce the overproduction of melanin, now that can happen when we interfere with the process of melanin production. For melanin to be produced inside the melanocyte cells, an enzyme is a molecule, a component which kind of helps a chemical reaction in our body. An enzyme called tyrosinase is required for the melanin production. So some of the skincare ingredients, what they can do is they can kind of inhibit the activity of this tyrosinase enzyme. They can kind of make this tyrosinase enzyme less effective. When this tyrosinase enzyme becomes less effective, less excess amount of melanin gets produced. So there are this whole range of skincare ingredients which target the tyrosinase enzyme. So that's one pathway. The second pathway for this anti-pigmentation skincare ingredients is when we actually reduce the transfer of all this excess melanin that's been produced inside melanocytes to keratinocytes. If they don't get to keratinocyte cells, then there is no pigmentation formed. So we're going to reduce the transfer, and there are skincare ingredients that can actually help us with that. Now the second way we can reduce the pigmentation is by using anti-inflammatory ingredients. Now these are the number one set of ingredients that we should use as soon as there's some kind of trauma on the skin. Now these ingredients, they kind of reduce the inflammation. Now you see, as soon as inflammation reduces, what reduces is the excess production of melanin. So our job is to reduce that inflammation as soon as any kind of trauma occurs on the skin. Now here's an important fact. Skin is actually almost always inflamed. Inflammation on the skin is something sometimes that's visible and sometimes that's not. When there's a minor trauma, it's visible. But some amount of minor trauma, our skin experiences almost constantly. So at least to a certain amount, at a certain level, skin is always inflamed. The reason I'm mentioning this is once we are aware of this fact, we will make sure that the anti-inflammatory ingredients become a part of our skincare routine every day, not just when there is a visible inflammation on the skin. The best way to tackle pigmentation is to not just to concentrate on one segment and just use skincare ingredients that address that. We need to use all of them. That's actually the only way pigmentation can reduce or be prevented. So we need to use the anti-inflammatory ingredients, we need to use the anti-pigment ingredients. Anti-pigment ingredients, the ones that actually inhibit the enzyme tyrosinase and the ones that reduce the transfer of melanin into keratinocytes. Now this anti-pigment set of ingredients becomes important, especially if you've got a darker skin tone. Above all this comes sunscreen. If we do all this and don't use sunscreen, no point. Sunscreen is something we need to use when the sun is out. Doesn't matter whether you're indoors or outdoors. Sun's UV rays can travel through glass, so even indoors we need to use sunscreen. Before I get to the skincare ingredients that address these two pathways, a very quick reminder about the dermal pigmentation which I spoke about earlier in the video. Now when this excess melanin gets produced, and sometimes when it's so hyper, some of the melanin gets accidentally dropped into the deeper layers of skin, and that's a dermal pigmentation. And dermal pigmentation is also visible on the skin. Though it's actually in the deeper layers of the skin, the pigmentation will be visible to our eyes. So that pigmentation is very difficult to remove. That's usually not something we can tackle with skincare ingredients. We would need a professional help, not a doctor's help as such, but something we need to go to a center where they would do some skin needling or dermabrasion. So a professional would do that. So that way they can get a bit deeper and remove the pigmentation from there. So those kind of pigmentations are much harder to tackle. And again, this is why the anti-inflammatory ingredients become so important. If we can control that inflammation, we actually stop it right at the start, right? So all this dermal pigmentation or epidermal pigmentation kind of reduces drastically or even stops. So that's why that anti-inflammatory ingredients are so very important. When this excess melanin is produced in melanocytes, the reason why this pigmentation, the hyperpigmentation, occurs only in certain sections of the skin is because of the uneven distribution of this excess melanin. The melanocyte cells don't distribute the same amount of melanin to keratinocyte cells. Sometimes they might actually end up distributing more amount of melanin to certain cells than the others. And so in those certain cells, an excess amount of melanin gets there, and that's how hyperpigmentation occurs only in that section of the skin. Now to the skincare ingredients which can actually help us tackle this pigmentation. Now the first one is alpha-arbutin. Alpha-arbutin is a tyrosinase inhibitor. So what alpha-arbutin does is it goes and interferes with the tyrosinase enzyme. By doing that, it makes it less effective. Once that enzyme becomes less effective, it actually produces, melanocyte cells produces less excess amount of melanin. Now alpha-arbutin is really a very powerful tyrosinase inhibitor. It actually releases something called hydroquinone very gradually and slowly. Hydroquinone is considered the gold standard in tackling pigmentation. But hydroquinone, the problem with that is it is often not used correctly. It is often misused. Plus, you need a dermatologist's prescription for using hydroquinone. And hydroquinone, when it's misused, which is what happens in a lot of cases, it can actually depigment your skin. It can actually destroy that melanin producing cells. That way, all the melanin is lost and your skin becomes depigmented, and that's very dangerous for the skin. Alpha-arbutin is a natural hydroquinone. It releases hydroquinone very slowly and very gradually. So gradually that it hardly does any of the damage that real hydroquinone, the original hydroquinone, can. Usually when it's used up to 2% alpha-arbutin is very effective in tackling that pigmentation. The next one is vitamin C. It's also called the ascorbic acid. Now this is also a tyrosinase inhibitor and an antioxidant. Now what it does is tyrosinase enzyme needs copper to help produce that melanin. Now vitamin C goes and takes away the copper. By taking away the copper, it inhibits the activity of tyrosinase enzyme, which then results in less excess production of melanin. So that's how it targets the source of melanin production. The second way is it's an antioxidant. You see, when there is inflammation, especially inflammation from sun's UV rays, something very nasty called free radicals get formed on the skin, which further aggravate the skin and compound the problem. Now vitamin C is a powerful antioxidant. It will go and neutralize these free radicals. By neutralizing the free radicals, it reduces the inflammation, the huge amount of inflammation that the free radicals can cause. And when inflammation goes down, the excess production of melanin goes down. Vitamin C, L-ascorbic acid, is very unstable. It is very difficult to use it in skincare products, and the skincare products which use it the right way are usually quite expensive. And that's why a lot of skincare manufacturers use derivatives of vitamin C. And not all derivatives of vitamin C will have the same tyrosinase inhibition property or the same antioxidant property as the pure form of vitamin C, which is the ascorbic acid. Another very powerful ingredient is licorice root extract. Now licorice root extract has got two important ingredients, which are glavridin and liquiritin. Now these two ingredients fight pigmentation in two different ways. Now the first way, the glavridin, fights it by by being a tyrosinase inhibitor. So it goes and messes up with the tyrosinase enzyme, which means less excess melanin production. Now the second ingredient, liquiritin, what it does is it disperses melanin. You see how we said when melanocytes produces this excess melanin, it gets into this hyper state and distributes this melanin unevenly, which results in certain cells having more deposits of melanin than the other cells. Now liquiritin ingredient, it disperses this melanin very evenly. It tries to help melanocyte cells distribute this melanin production evenly. That means the lumps of melanin don't get deposited in one cell. That means the pigmentation drastically reduces. The second way in which licorice root extract can help is because of its anti-inflammation property. So it's also going to bring that inflammation down, and any reduction in inflammation is going to result in less production of melanin, which means less hyperpigmentation or no hyperpigmentation. Okay. Licorice root extract is an ingredient which is found in a lot of moisturizers and a lot of serums, but for it to actually tackle that pigmentation effectively, it needs to be used at around 10%. The next ingredient is kojic acid, again another effective ingredient. Now this needs to be used between 1 and 4%. It's a tyrosinase inhibitor. It's going to mess up with that copper that the enzyme tyrosinase needs, and thus inhibits the activity of tyrosinase, which means less excess melanin production. It's also an antioxidant, so it's going to reduce the free radicals which inflammation can cause, and by reducing free radicals, it kind of indirectly reduces inflammation. That means less excess melanin production. The next ingredient is azelaic acid. This is also a very powerful ingredient. For it to be able to tackle pigmentation though, it needs to be used at a very high percentage, around 15 to 20%, and in some countries for this percentage you might need a prescription from a dermatologist. Now azelaic acid is really powerful. It is an anti-inflammatory ingredient, plus it's also a tyrosinase inhibitor, messes with the tyrosinase and reduces that melanin production. Now the next one is hydroquinone. Now this is considered the gold standard in pigmentation, but it does have a lot of disadvantages. A lot of people misuse this ingredient. It's a super strong ingredient. If misused, which is what happens in a lot of cases, it can depigment the skin and it can cause a lot of harm to the skin. And thankfully for this ingredient to be used on our skin, we need a prescription from the doctor. But unfortunately, even though we need a prescription, a lot of people find ways to purchase this ingredient and just don't use this, basically don't use this ingredient without a doctor's advice, because it can cause a lot more harm than good, but it does do a lot of good too. So if you go with the help of a doctor, this is the ingredient, but go with the doctor's help. Don't do it alone. The next set of ingredients are the tretinoin, retinoids, the retinal, retinol, and the retinoic acid, all the vitamin A derivatives. Now they help pigmentation in two different ways. Number one, they are tyrosinase inhibitors, so they're going to mess up with the tyrosinase enzyme and reduce the melanin production. But a more important essential benefit, which all the other ingredients can't offer, is that these set of ingredients help with the cell renewal. Now you see what happens is cells in the top layer of the skin have to fall off regularly and make way for the newer and the younger cells from the deeper layers of the skin. But often not enough new cells are formed in the deeper layers of the skin, especially with age. So if not enough new cells get formed, not enough new cells can travel and replace that old cells at the top of the skin. Now this process becomes important because when melanin gets distributed by melanocyte cells to keratinocyte cells, some of them, because of the uneven distribution of the melanin, end up with excess amount of melanin, and that's how the pigmentation is formed. All these cells which are in the top layer of the skin, some of these cells, they have this excess amount of melanin, deposits of melanin. So if they get replaced regularly by the newer cells from the deeper layers of the skin, the excess melanin that they are carrying inside them will also go away along with them. But if they are not going to get replaced, they're just going to be stuck there, and that pigmentation is going to be visible on and on and on. So the way these set of ingredients help is they increase the cell renewal by increasing the production of the newer cells at the deeper layers of the skin. So they also are, that is actually the main reason why they're classified as anti-aging ingredients, because they produce that, they help in the production of more new cells, which also helps with the removal, tackling of the pigmentation. The next ingredient is the tranexamic acid. Now this ingredient is an anti-inflammatory ingredient. It's going to calm the skin, soothe the skin, reduce that inflammation and bring that excess production of melanin down. The last ingredient I want to mention is niacinamide, which is an anti-inflammatory ingredient, brings that inflammation down, and it also reduces the transfer of melanin. So the melanin that gets produced in melanocytes, it has to be distributed to keratinocyte cells. Now what niacinamide does is it reduces the transfer of this melanin to keratinocyte cells. If it doesn't reach the keratinocyte cells, excess melanin, then it's going to reduce that pigmentation. Remember that all this inhibition of the tyrosinase enzyme, less melanin, is all being done for the excess melanin production. None of these ingredients, except hydroquinone, if used incorrectly, is going to attack the melanin production as such. In fact, in skincare, none of these ingredients are going to be used at percentages which will reduce the complete melanin production. They're only tackling the excess production of melanin. Having said that, hydroquinone is an ingredient we just need to be careful and always use only under the assistance of a doctor. Apart from this, there are a whole set of other anti-inflammatory ingredients like panthenol, aloe vera, etc. Now these are all going to calm the skin. The best way to incorporate anti-inflammatory ingredients every day in your routine is to make sure that your moisturizer has a good set of anti-inflammatory ingredients. So that way we're calming the skin down on a regular basis. Moisturizers by default don't necessarily have to have anti-inflammatory ingredients because that's not the role of a moisturizer. But a lot of moisturizers, good moisturizers these days, have anti-inflammatory ingredients in them. So have a look out for them and find those ones. I'm going to list a few good anti-inflammatory ingredients also in the description box below. I'm going to mention all these ingredients that I just spoke about, the anti-pigment ones and the anti-inflammatory ingredients, and a few additional other ingredients as well in the description box below. So please do check it out. The main thing is whenever we do anything traumatic to the skin, that could be like threading, or it could be waxing of the skin, or exfoliation of the skin, or we've been out in the sun longer than usual, anything a bit traumatic to the skin, you need to immediately start using extra amount of anti-inflammatory ingredients, not just the ingredients that's there in your regular moisturizer. And then also use this anti-pigment ingredients, especially that becomes crucial if you've got a darker skin tone. Now pigmentation unfortunately cannot be tackled with just one set of ingredients. It's a bit fussy. It needs a whole range of ingredients. It needs an anti-inflammatory ingredient, it needs a couple of anti-pigment ingredients, and that's the only way you can reduce or get rid of that pigmentation. And if it's a dermal pigmentation, we need to go and get a professional help and do some microneedling or other procedures that they would recommend. The biggest cause of pigmentation is sun's UV rays, and that can only be prevented by using the sunscreen. If you use all this and don't use sunscreen, it's of no use. If you use sunscreen and don't use all of this, then you're halfway through. Another way we can also reduce the pigmentation is by exfoliating our skin regularly. Exfoliation is a process of getting rid of these old cells. See, sometimes these old cells don't fall off, not because there are not enough new cells. They don't fall off because they're just stubborn. They all just cling to each other and they form a dull layer on top of the skin, and if they have that excess amount of melanin deposits in them, that pigmentation and that uneven skin tone is going to be visible for as long those old cells are there on top of the skin. So exfoliation is a process of getting rid of that old cells. Go for chemical exfoliants because they're much nicer to the skin than the physical exfoliants. Physical exfoliants are the seeds and other things which are scrubs, and that can be a bit harsh on the skin. Anything harsh on the skin will result in inflammation and will again cause pigmentation. So when you exfoliate your skin, you're getting rid of the top stubborn layer, and along with it, the deposits of melanin that's in them also goes away. So exfoliate regularly. And again, it's a cycle, you see. After exfoliation, skin is going to become a bit tender. So that future in pigmentation exfoliation doesn't occur, immediately apply some calming ingredients on the skin so any inflammation that the exfoliation can cause is reduced. There's something called acid peels where a high concentration of these chemical exfoliants are used on the skin so that a lot of this pigmentation is tackled. But that you cannot do at home. That can be too risky to do at home. It can actually inflame the skin a lot. So go to a professional and get acid peels. If you need acid peels, they'll suggest that to you and you can get that done under a professional's guidance. That's about it. I hope you really found this video useful. I actually quite enjoyed making this video. Just to summarize, use a sunscreen every day, even if you're indoors, that's a must. Use a moisturizer that's got good anti-inflammatory ingredients. If you've done anything, even a minor, small amount of trauma to the skin, it could be something as simple as threading, just make sure you use an extra layer of anti-inflammatory serum so that can calm the skin. If you've got a darker skin tone, anti-pigment ingredients have to be a part of your skincare routine. The way pigmentation works is you have to use anti-inflammatory and a couple of different anti-pigment ingredients in your skincare routine. So it needs a range of ingredients. Just one ingredient unfortunately cannot tackle pigmentation or reduce that pigmentation. And for deeper layers of pigmentation, if the pigmentation is not going away, if you're doing all these things, that means it's probably in the deeper layers, then you need to do some micro needling or the dermabrasion to get rid of that pigmentation. I hope you found the video useful. I'll see you in the next video. Please give me a like and do subscribe to my channel. That will really help me a lot. Bye for now.